What's good, team? Welcome to another Small James coding tutorial where today we're going to be learning React, everything you need to know to hit the ground running and start building your own React projects today. So here we have a quick demo of the finished React application. So it's basically going to be Lord of the Rings information where we have a nice responsive web page with three options. So here we can load all the books. So it will load all the books. We could load all the movies. Here we have all of the movies with all of the budgets, runtime, all that information. And finally, we have the characters. So we have a long list of characters, all of the characters, and a neat little search feature up the top. So we could check for, characters including this particular character set and filter through them. The page is super nice and responsive. Once again, all of the information is mapped out, and it should be just perfect for teaching you everything you need to know about React. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Let's get into it. So, to dive into the code, the first thing we're going to do is open up a Visual Studio Code editor and come down into our terminal here and cd into our project directory. So for me, that's going to be documents/tutorials, and in here we're going to run npm create vite. Just like that. We're going to install everything we need to and give it a name. So it's going to be Lord of the Rings project. Now we want to select React, and now we can cd into that directory, Lord of the Rings project. And in here we can run npm i to install all of our packages. And finally, npm run dev to start our project up on localhost 3000. So now I've opened the actual folder up in our Visual Studio Code editor, and we can see that Vite creates a React project with a pretty simple boilerplate code. Here we have the project displaying at localhost 3000, and if we come into the source code, we can see that our entry point is within the app.jsx file, and this content relies on this main.javascript file to inject our React application into this index.html file inside this root div. So the first thing we can do is come into our app.javascript file and gut all of this content just like that. So now we have a blank React application, and we can just come in here and type James or whatever you like, and we can see that we have that displaying up here. We're also just going to come into this index page, and we might just keep the font family the same, but we will, and actually these styles look alright, but we'll also just come into the app.css file and get everything and just remove all. So now we're sitting in the top left hand corner of the page. Now from here, what we're going to do is open up a new tab and come into the one API dev.dev, and this is the API for the Lord of the Rings information. And we're going to sign up for a new account. And once you've completed that registration, it should have taken you to a page that has an access code. And we're going to come into our document and create a .env file. And in here, we're going to say API key is equal to, and you just want to paste in whatever your API key or your access code is in here. And actually, I lie, I think this needs to be a React app underscore API key. So paste that key in just there, and then save this file. So now that we've configured our API key in our React application, the first thing we want to do is actually understand a bit about React applications. So fundamentally how a React application works is through a system called componentry. And so essentially, as I mentioned earlier, we have this app.javascript file which renders out a functional component, where a functional component is just a function that returns what's known as JSX, which is just HTML, as you might regularly see it, intermingled with JavaScript. Now, the main difference in the JSX between original or traditional HTML is the fact that class is now class name. But other than that, it's just a functional component that has some JavaScript logic with some funny things like useState, which we'll touch on in a minute. And typically what you would have is a functional component per utility that you have on your page. So an example would be, if this is my React application, I could just have a div in here that's a header, and I could say this is the header, and then what I might have is a dashboard component. So now this is a subcomponent, and it's denoted with a capitalized letter, so dashboard, and we treat it as if it was a regular HTML tag. Now this won't return anything because we haven't created that component, but what we can do is create a new folder in our source file called components, and in here we can make a new file, call that dashboard.jsx, and in here we can use the shorthand RFC to create us a new functional component called dashboard that returns some additional JSX. And so now when I save that and import it, so here we import dashboard, now that gets rendered onto the page, and finally I could have a footer as I traditionally would. This is the footer, and it's absolute magic. So one of the things that you'll have to figure out yourself when you start learning React is when it's good to separate code out into its own component, and typically it becomes whenever your file is getting a little bit large. As I kind of mentioned earlier, it's typically like a feature per functional component. So you might have a navbar component, you might have a main dashboard that has, sub-components, you might have a footer component. Typically it's good practice to split up to keep your app.jsx pretty lean. So what I might just have is the primary items, which is just our div, our header, our dashboard, and our footer. And the dashboard would be the new entry point for all of our subcomponentry in here. And that's exactly what we're going to do for this particular project. And the first thing we're going to do is actually use this class name .app, and we can access this in this app.css file by saying .app. And we're going to give this a min height of 100% of the view height. We're going to give it a display of flex, a flex direction of column, just like that. And then what we can do is target the dashboard, which is rendered just here. And to be honest, we might actually just wrap that inside of a main element. And so we have our footer. We can come back in here and target the main, give that a flex of 1, so that should push the footer down to the bottom. We can give this additionally a display of flex, a flex direction of column. And finally, we could target the footer and just give this a padding of 4, maybe 10 pixels, just like that. And we could also give it a display of grid and place items center. So now that's centered. Equally, we could also just target the header while we're here and give this a display of flex. We might also just give it a padding of 10 pixels also. And while we're at it, we could do the exact same thing with the main page content, which is just going to be padding 10 pixels. Now what I might do additionally is just actually give this a position of absolute. Well, actually I might even just make that fixed, and I'm going to say top of 0, left of 0, width is going to be 100% of the screen, or the parent element to be more specifically, and I'll also just give this a position of relative just up here. So now that we've added all these styles, what we can do is render out a cheeky home image here. So we can give this an image of source, and we're going to come to Google and find some great Lord of the Rings pictures. So Lord of the Rings, we're going to go to images, we will go tools, we'll get size, large, and we're going to go for landscape specifically. Once again, make sure that we get those large images. And, we might take this one, and that's also a pretty cool image as well. But I think the one that we're actually going to go with is this particular picture just here. And I'm going to open this image in a new tab and copy this particular link. And now I can paste it in here. Give this image an alt of Lord of the Rings background image. And close that, and I'm also just going to give this a class name equal to bg image. So now we can just quickly whip back into our CSS file and target that background image, and we can give that an object fit cover. And now if we come into our application, it almost covers the entire app. However, you'll notice that my padding has actually done me a disservice, so I'm going to once again remove that padding. And I think for the sake of this particular app, we actually don't need a footer. So we can remove that. And I think that we can also just give this a display of flex, and now our image will take up the entire page. But we're also just going to add flex direction column to the main. Now we'll notice that because we haven't given this a position of absolute, it's currently not behaving quite right, and so we just want to give that also an inset of 0. And so now we can see that our image is just ever so slightly overflowing the page, and so the last thing we're just going to add is an overflow of hidden, just here to keep it contained within the page, and so now we'll have a responsive Lord of the Rings image. So the next thing we're going to do is come into our dashboard, and our dashboard is where all of the magic is going to happen, and so we are going to create what is known as a modular style sheet. So there's a couple of ways that you can style divs, and the first one is using a style tag. So you could put in a style here that said color is equal to green, and you would expect to see green text. Now we should be able to get this dashboard showing up by putting this image to the back, so we can give the image just here a Z index of 0. And now if we come into our thing again and just add Z index 50, we can see that dashboard text showing up in a green particular color up the top. Now this is known as an inline style, and it's actually not the best practice, and so what we're going to do is remove that, and as I mentioned just a moment ago, we're going to create what is known as a modular style sheet, and so that file will be called dashboard.module.css, and in here we can create styles that are scoped to specifically to this particular component. And so for example, if I wanted to give this a class name of dashboard, what we would do is come into our modular style sheet and make a dashboard. And in here, once again, we can set the display to flex, the flex direction to column, the overflow to scroll, and the color to white, the Z index to 50, and the position to relative. And now to apply that style sheet, the first thing we have to do is import styles from that particular dashboard.module.css, and now we can apply it by accessing it as if it were an object, so styles.dashboard. And now you'll see that that dashboard comes up on the top of our screen, just as we would expect it to. And in here we can just enter that down and go crazy with our componentry to our wildest dreams. Now, as I kind of mentioned earlier, one of the benefits of React is that it's very, very dynamic. It's great for dynamic pages because the content can be easily interacted with JavaScript and consequently is not very static. An example would be I can say const demo string is equal to James is cool, and I can render that out onto my page simply by using curly braces. Curly braces are used to contain JavaScript inside of the JSX or the HTML, and I can just call demo string. Equally, I could have a truthy statement, so I could say const truth is equal to true, for example, and that's not how you spell truth. And in here, I could have a conditionally rendered statement, so I could say truth. If it's true, I want to render out an h1 tag that says this is h1. And otherwise, I want to render out a div, for example. Well, actually, no, let's make it easier. A paragraph tag that just says this is a paragraph. And so just like that, we have that h1 tag showing up, and consequently, if I were to change this to false, we get the paragraph. And so just like that, we can see a number of ways that we can use JavaScript to dynamically render items on the page. Another example would be to have a conditionally rendered element, and I could use the truth example again, and just say double and have an h2 that says this is only rendered when truth is true. So now this element only renders when the truth element is true. Currently it's false, so it's not rendered, but if I change that to true, then we get both those truth statements. Now we can take this a step further by incorporating what's known as use state. And use state is essentially the same thing as a variable, except it's used to manage values or parameters that are specifically interactive. The reason is, currently, even if I defined this truth statement as a let, I couldn't go ahead and update this value on user interaction. I could go ahead here and say truth is equal to false. That's totally acceptable, and we get the false thing. But if I had a button with an onClick variable, let's just say like that, and I open that up and I set truth is equal to true, and in here let's say I have button, and I click that, that doesn't do anything. That doesn't set the parameter to true. So for this kind of interactive element, what we have to use is something known as use state. And we can define use state just like this. So we use the square parentheses. The first argument in the square parentheses, so in the 0th index, is the name of the state. So I could have truthy, and the second argument is a setter function for that particular variable. So it's typically just denoted as set and then whatever the original variable name was. And we just say use state like this. Equally, what you can do is you can pass in a default value. So let's say I wanted it to originally be false. And now what I can do is I can replace these truth statements with this truthy. And instead of setting truthy like this, just equal to true, we'd actually call the setter function. And that's going to re-render the page and update everything for the new truthy value. So I could just set it to the inverse of whatever truthy currently is. So now we'll see that every time I click the button, it's going to dynamically reset this truthy state parameter, and the page re-renders for the new information. So that's all well and good. Equivalently, what I could actually do to tidy this particular example up is set an onClick handler function just like this, and it will do the exact same thing, except with the benefit of me being able to not use an anonymous function here and just pass the onClick as you would add an event listener to a traditional HTML document, and it will have the exact same effect. So now the first thing we're going to do in our actual application is just come in here and clear everything out except for the use state and the click handler. So consequently, what I'm going to do is also empty out this content just in here, and we can just leave the button for now. Actually, what I might do is just remove it. And we're going to create a new file. So this is going to be a new component, and this is going to be options, and we're going to call it .jsx. Now we're going to use that RFC option again, just like that, to create our options component, and we're going to render it out in our original app. So here we're going to say options, just like that, click enter for the automatic imports, and we're going to close that as we would a traditional tag, and that is now rendered out onto our page. Now for our dashboard, we've given this a display of flex and a flex direction of column. We can actually change that for the second to be a display of grid and place items center so that it's centered in the page. Now what we're going to do is we're going to define a typical variable, and this is going to be called questions, and we're going to make this an array, and the entries in the array are going to come from our API just here. And so we're going to head over to the documentation and check out what routes are available. And so as we can see, we've got books, we've got movies, we've got characters, quotes, and chapters. And so for this particular demo, we're just going to focus on the characters, movies, and books. And in here, we're going to do exactly that. So we're going to say characters, movies, and books. And those are singular, so it's going to be just like that, book and character. And the other thing we're going to define is our const API URL, and that is equal to this just here, v2. And lastly, we're going to get our API token, which is equal to process.env.react_app API token. And I was actually wrong, that is a key. And with that, we can introduce the next React hook. These are known as React hooks, and that's going to be a use effect. And a use effect is basically created by passing in an anonymous function as the argument to the use effect. And this code block in here will get executed depending on what we pass in as the second argument, which is an array, and it's also known as the dependency array. So if we leave an empty dependency array, that's essentially telling React that we want this code block to execute on page load. If we were to pass in a variable such as truthy, that would instead say we want this code block to execute whenever truthy changes. Now, we're going to be using this use effect on the on mount of the React document, and the reason for that is because we're going to be using it to fetch data. And so inside of our use effect, what we're going to do is create an asynchronous function called fetch data, and we're going to create a try, catch, error, and finally block inside of our function where we can say const response is equal to await fetch URL. Prior to this, we're actually going to construct our URL, so we're going to say const URL is equal to API URL plus the selected question. So for the second, I'm just going to set it as a default to book, and I might actually split it out into two separate strings, just like that. And we can say const data is equal to await res.json. And in here, we can say set error equal to error.message. And in this finally block, what we're going to do is set loading to false. Now, once again, these are setter functions for state variables. And so what we're going to do is define these state parameters just up here. So I'm actually going to duplicate this line 3 times. The first one is going to be data and set data. The second one is going to be loading and set loading. And finally, we're going to have error and set error. Now the defaults for these are going to be null, false, and null. And now when this code block gets run on our page load, we're going to create a fetch request to this particular URL. Whatever we end up with as the data, we're going to set data to that particular parameter, just like that. And so I might actually just rename this to JSON data so that we don't have 2 parameters. While we're at it, I'm actually just going to console.log data, just like that, so we can see it. And now finally in this code block, I'm actually just going to call the fetch data function. And so this block of code, since we have passed nothing into the dependency array, should execute on our page load, and we should actually see something back from our Lord of the Rings API. So if we come into our console, we can see that process is not defined. And the way that we can actually fix this is by coming into our Vite config, and we can just say define in here, open that up as an object, and we can say process.env is equal to an empty object. And so this particular code here will mean that when we define our API token, just like this, it will read in successfully, and we can see that our data fetching call has actually executed, and we have 3 documents here with the IDs and names of each of the books. Now, the one particular thing about this component is that it's actually starting to get a little bit long, and so what we can do to make this even cleaner and is quintessentially React is separate this into more componentry. However, in this particular case, it's going to be more specifically a hook, and we can create a new folder called hooks, and we can create a new file called usefetchdata.jsx. We can create that as a component just like that. And we can copy this logic just here, so this entire use effect across into our use fetch data here, and we can do the exact same thing with the data error and loading. So paste that into the top of the functional component. And finally, make sure we import both useState and useEffect from React. And now what we can do in this particular file is clean up everything really nicely and just call const data loading and error is equal to useFetchData, just like that. And so that automatically imported from our hooks file. However, we had one last issue because we also have to define our API URL in the fetch data file. So we'll paste them both here. And the other thing I forgot to mention is that a hook does not return JSX. Instead, we can actually return the parameters themselves. So we can return data, error, and loading, just like that. And you can see that we get the exact same effect, except now our dashboard is way cleaner. And all we have to do is import these 3 variables from our hook, and our hook is separated into just our fetch data logic. So that's super cool. What if we could wire that up to all occur on a button click? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be doing now. And we're going to be doing that using our options.jsx file just here. So to begin, we're actually going to start off by copying these questions into that file. So we're going to paste them into our options here. And we're going to render out some buttons for each option. Now, one way we could do that is by having a button that has a questions, and we access the 0th entry. So here you can see we have a button that has character on it, just like that. And we could duplicate this 3 times and have one for each entry. Now, it would be pretty easy to wire these buttons up to create that fetch request for the particular type of information that we have. However, there's a more efficient way we can do it using a map. So instead, we could use our curly braces for JavaScript information, and we could instead say questions.map, where map takes an anonymous function, and we can return, you have to return JSX, and that could be our button, just like that. Now, this isn't quite finished. The map, if you're unfamiliar with mapping, it basically maps over every entry in our array and returns something that is a variation of that input. So our map is going to loop over each thing, where each thing becomes the argument in our anonymous function. So here I could call this question, and we can actually receive an optional second argument called the index, and we need the index because mapping out JSX requires that the parent tag of whatever is returned contains a unique identifier key. And in this particular case, we can just set the key equal to the index because the index will always be unique for every item rendered out onto the page. And so what we could do in here is just have the question itself. So the question will assume each value of that string. And now you can see that I've managed to create the same effect. However, I've only actually written out the button JSX once. And so this is much more efficient because we only have to style this particular button. And so now what we can do is start to style these elements. And we just want to ensure that the parent container occupies the full width of the page. And so the parent container is this dashboard, and here we have the dashboard. And so we can just check that by saying background white. And if we save that, we can see that it actually only occupies a tiny percentage of the page, whereas we want to ensure that it occupies the full width of the page. And so we can once again go to the parent element. Here we have main. So main is found in here, and here we have display flex. And we could just say flex direction column, just like that. And then we can come into the dashboard and give this a flex of 1. And so now we can see that it does in fact occupy the entire page, and we can just remove that background. So now the next thing that we're going to do is just style this button. So we can do that by giving this a class name equal to styles.button. And here we can import styles from /options.module.css. Now obviously that file doesn't exist, but we can quickly create it. So that's going to be options.module.css. And in here we could give a dot button style and just say outline, none, background could be RGBA 0, 0.3. And we can say, and honestly we could just start off with that. So if I save both of these, we can see that we have removed the background. We can also set the border to none, and probably the color to white so that we can actually read it. So now we have these three buttons here. We probably also want to give them a cursor pointer. Now what I'm also just going to do is come back into here and add an H1 tag just above this that says Lord of the Rings info. So here we have Lord of the Rings info just like that. And now we're going to come into Google Fonts. So we're going to go Google Fonts, come into the fonts section, and we're going to add two fonts. The first one is called Medieval Sharp. And so we're going to scroll down and select this regular font to add it to our font selection. And we're going to follow that up with just, so just here. And we can select a bunch of these. So maybe just something like that. And now what we can do is copy this link tag just here. And we're going to paste this into our index.html inside of the head tags. So just like that, we can save that. And now while we're in this HTML document, we're also just going to open up a style tag and select everything in our entire document. And we're going to say font family is equal to just with a backup of sans serif, and then we're going to select our H1 tags and say font family equal to medieval sharp with a backup of cursive, just like that. And so now if I come back into our page, we can see that we have Lord of the Rings info and these little fonts down here have adjusted it. So now we're actually going to need this Lord of the Rings info to persist across the components that get displayed on the page. So I'm actually going to pop it out and move it inside of a div here, place that as Lord of the Rings info, and I'm also going to place options inside of there. And now what I can do inside of this options section is change this to return what's known as a fragment, which is essentially just an empty div. So it's like technically a container without actually taking up any containerization space. And the reason fragments are important is because technically each functional component can only return one parent tag. So you can only have one wrapping tag. So we could only have one wrapping div. I couldn't have a follow-up div to this particular component here. If I did want to, I would have to add another parent tag, so there is only one parent element returned per component. So now that we have this, the next thing we're going to do is define a state. And so in here, I'm going to define a new state variable called selection. And this parameter, the setter function, is going to be called setSelection. And this is going to have an initial state of null. Now for our data fetching process, we're actually going to want to pass in our selection. And so we can come into our hook, use fetch data, and receive that selection as an argument. And we're going to add it to the top of our function here and just say if not selection. So if selection is false, then we just want to return nothing from this. So that's called a guard clause. If there is a selection, then we want to carry on through with this particular process. And what we can do in here now that we have this set selection is we want to pass down selection is the first thing. So we can say selection just like that. And we also want to pass down the set selection function just like that. So now these two particular items are being passed down as props into this component, and we can consequently receive them inside of that component as props. And then we can destructure the arguments out. So that was selection and set selection is equal to props. Now this is the best way to pass components down through a component tree, and we will see why in a minute. But actually what we're going to do to make this process even better is we're actually going to define an onClick handler just in here that sets the selection equal to whatever the input is here. So we can just call this selection for the minute. set selection equal to selection. Or actually, we can be even more specific and say clicked button, just like this. So this is the argument. And finally, what we're going to do is actually return that as an anonymous function, or this is also known as a curried function. And now we can pass that onClick handler just down as the set selection. And now in our child component, we can apply that onClick event just as we would a traditional function. So, you know, if we didn't use that curried function, we would have to go, okay, set selection, and then pass in the question just like that. But because we have used that curried function syntax in the parent component, we can just say set selection is equal to question. So now we should be able to update the state of that parent component, and we could do that by just console.logging the value of selection. So I can say selection value just here, and we can say selection. So if we have a look at that, we can see that currently it is character, now it's movie, now it's book, now it's character. And this is excellent because what we can do now is we can add a secondary style to this. So we can come back into our options and we can say .selected button, if I can spell that right. And we can actually say that it instead has a color of hashtag 0F172A and a background of white, just like that. And we can set this as a non-selected button and add some conditional styling by just copying out the color and the background, just like that. And now what we want to do is create a combination of these particular states. We'll see how we can do that in just a second. And we can combine these styles by actually returning this inside of a template literal string, so just like that. And then if we add a space in between it, we have the ability to add a secondary style that can be based on the value of a JavaScript parameter. So in here we could say question equal to the value of selection. So if that is true, then we want to return styles.selected button. And if it is false, then we want to go styles.non-selected button. And so what this syntax means is that our style will be a combination of button. They will both receive the button styles, and so the button styles are the essential ones up here. And then depending on whether or not the question value, which is the actual string, matches whatever is selected, then the selected button style will be applied, which is one set of colors, or the non-selected button style will be applied, which is the non-selected colors. And so now you can see that we can just navigate these three icons just like that. Easy peasy. And now that selection is being updated, we should also note that we rerun our hook, and that should be updating just here. But currently the reason it's not updating is because we have to make this use effect block, this code that currently is running on page load, dependent on the value of selection. So if I just add selection into the variable page here, we can see that the request gets run additionally, and it will get run now every time I change the value of selection. So it listens for changes in selection, and if selection is varied, then it exists, then we will execute this fetch data block. Now, what we actually want to do is adjust this so this actually looks for the value of selection. So now we can see that the book still works. However, if we run character, we get an unauthorized token, and that's because we have to pass in our token to this particular fetch request. And we can add this token into our fetch request by adding some headers. And so just up here, we're going to say let options equal to an object. And inside of this object, we can say headers is equal to an object that has the key of authorization, because we can see that in this API, it requires our authorization to be in this particular format. And so we can just set that to a dynamic string that says bearer, just like this. And here we can have our API token. And now what we can do is we can just pass in our options as a secondary argument to our fetch request just here. And for the sake of it, we could also actually just add in the method, which will be get. And so now what we will find is our thing is still not working because our key is undefined. And so if you come into your process.env, you just want to make sure that this here lines up exactly with whatever you have in your env file. And it turns out that's actually because we're not supposed to be using the process.env and Vite. That's with the original React syntax. So instead what we do is we type import meta.env, and then we have the name of the API key. So now we would expect that to actually render out our API key. And now if we once again come back to our application and click on movie, and it turns out that this is actually meant to be named Vite underscore API key. So you'll just want to update that header in your env file as well. And so now when I click on movie, after we've changed that to Vite API key and we pass in these headers with our authorization token, we should be able to click on movie. And we can see that movie does indeed run, and we get the docs back with all the different movies. And likewise, if I click on character, we would expect the same thing. So character runs. So that's super cool. Now, there's obviously a lot of characters here, so that is really interesting. But the next thing we're going to do is actually look at how we can show this information on the page. So for that, we're going to come back into our dashboard. And here what we're going to do is add a conditional statement. So if selected exists, and so for that we're going to have some JavaScript logic, and we're going to say if selected or selection and loading, or even better than that, we should use data and loading. So if data exists and loading exists, so I'm just going to wrap those in a parentheses. Then what we want to do is render out some HTML. So in here I'm going to render out a new component that will render something that depends on the value of selection. And so for that, what we're going to do is come up here and just have a const object for some object literal rendering. So I'm going to say const data render is equal to an object, and I'm going to open that up, and I'm going to create the three particular keys that we have. So the first one is character, then we have, and I'm going to duplicate that 2 times and change that to book, and the last one to movie. And what I'm going to do is create 3 new components just in here. So I'm going to say books.jsx, RFC that, and I'm going to create a new one that is characters.jsx, RFC that, and finally we're going to have movies.jsx, and I'm going to RFC that. And so what this means is that we can associate a component with the data that is rendered on the page. So here I can say characters, import that just up there and render that as a component. And here I can say books, render that as a component. And finally I can say movie and render movies. And we have those 3 importing just up here as you'd expect. And so down here, this is obviously not working, but if this statement returns true, so data and loading are both true, then we can have our data render for the particular selection. So the last thing we're just going to have to do is come into our useFetchData hook and make sure that our variables are set. So our loading is set to false. What we want to do is when we come into this function, we want to set loading equal to true. So what that's going to do is it's going to set the loading to true, then it's going to execute this function, and finally set loading will be set to false again, and then everything will be perfect. So now we can see if I click on movies, we have movies, and then if I click on book, we have book. And I just noticed that because of the way that's working, this needs to be updated to not loading, because we actually want the value of loading to be false and the data to exist. So now it should say characters. When the movie's loaded, it says movies, and when the books have loaded, it says books. And what we could do is we could just say if it's loading, so we could say loading. If that's true, then we could just render out another component. So we could say and, just like this, and have a div just here. And what we could do is give this a class name equal to styles.loader. And now once again, this is in our dashboard. So what I might even just do is create an additional component for our loader. So let's just call this loader.jsx, RFC that, and I can create a modular style sheet, so loader.module.css, and in here I can say .loader, and then in our loader component we can copy this code that we defined just here and paste that into our loader, and then we can actually just render out the loader right here. So the loader will render when this content is loading. And that just errored because we have to make sure we import our styles from /loader.module.css. So now we get our page to load. I noticed that somewhere we have a header lying around. So that's just here. So what I'm going to do is just comment out this header because we do not need it. And I'm going to come into our loader.module.css, and we're just going to give this a height of 10 pixels, a width of 10 pixels, a margin of 0 auto, a border radius of 100%, so it's nice and round. We can give it a background of white, so we should expect that to pop up on the page, and the border radius should actually be 50%, and it will be if we change this initial state to true. And so now we have that little dot here. We might also just give this a class name while we're at it in our dashboard component. We can say styles.layout. So we could come into our dashboard quickly and just say .layout is also display of flex direction is column, and we might just give it a gap of 4 pixels just to spread these items out a tiny little bit. We will also come into our options quickly and just give this a div so that they should sit adjacent to one another like they do there. And now we should have a 4 pixel gap just down there, which we actually do. I might just also give the loader a margin top of maybe 20 pixels just to push it down a little bit, just like that. And we can increase this size to maybe more like 30 pixels, so it's a bit rounder. Perfect. And now what we can do is be clever and design our own loader. So and the way that we do that is starting off by giving this a position of relative, a Z index of 10, and then we want to actually change the background to transparent. And I've actually totally just changed my mind. We're not going to worry about any of this, except for just having a p tag in here that says loading ... And now what happens is we'll have the loading, and we also just want to make sure that this has a margin of 0 and auto so that it's centered. So now we have that centered loading text while it's loading, and I might actually change that so this is false. So on page load, everything is false. So we don't have everything. As soon as we click on character, we get the loading, and then we get all the characters coming down onto the page. Same for movies, and so on and so forth. So now we can come in and style these particular elements, and to access this information, what we're going to do is pass it down from our dashboard where we get the data. So we're just going to say data is equal to data, just like that, and we're going to pass the information down to each of them. Data equals data. Data equals data. So now we have all of this information that comes back to us. And so here, if we look at what it looks like, it's typically the docs, and then we have a whole lot of items, and we can just display all the different information about each of them. So we're going to start off one at a time. Here we have movies, so we may as well start off with the movies. So the first thing we'll do is open up the movie component, and in here we're just going to first receive the props. So props, and we can destructure data out of it. So const data is equal to props, and in here we return a div, and this can just contain all of this information. So what we're going to do here is give this a class name equal to, we could say styles.movie dashboard, and we can go ahead and create a file that's movies.module.css, and now we can import that. So import styles from /movies.module.css, and I think what we're going to do in here is just have movie dashboard And we're just going to give this a display of flex direction of column, and a background of RGBA 000 0.3, a color of white, and we might also just say a gap of like 4 pixels or something pretty small. Maybe you can make that 8 pixels. And now what we're going to do is map over all of the items in here and create a subcomponent tree. And so how this will look on the screen is we're going to use that map syntax again. So we're going to say data.docs, just like that. And now that is an array, so we can map over that. And this is going to be a particular movie. Now we're also going to want to get the index, so we're going to introduce that as an argument and then open up an anonymous function where we return a particular value, and in this particular case I'm going to make that a div with the key equal to the index once again, and we can close that div. And so in here, for the time being, what we could probably just do is render out movie.name, and so we would expect to see all the movies coming up just like they have here, which is perfect. And now we notice that these elements up here are not centered, so I might also just come in and adjust that. So if we come into the options, here we have all our buttons. In this particular div, we can give it a class name equal to styles.button container, just like that. And so we can open up this module sheet and just say .button container, and we just want to give this a margin of 0 and auto horizontally so that these should become centered. So now we save that, and then we will also save this element here, and we can see that now our items are centered. And now we will also come into the dashboard and make sure that this is centered just here. And with something like this, honestly, what we could just do is have a style is equal to double brackets, margin is 0 auto. Now we really shouldn't be doing that because you're not supposed to use inline styles like that, but we're just going to be lazy and do it that way. So here we have all of the book names. What we could do is possibly wrap them inside of h1 tags, so we get that special font being applied. So now we have all of the Lord of the Rings movies. And we actually don't want this to overflow the length of the page. We want to have some scrolling on it. And so if we come into our dashboard and look at the dashboard styles, so in here what we could say is max height, 100% of the view height. And now what we would expect to happen is just to have this element here scroll. So we can see that now the background will remain stationary and this content will just scroll over the page, which is fine. And I might also just give this a padding of 10 pixels like that. So now that sits a little bit down from the header. And so now that that's working, what we can do is come into movies, and underneath movies, for each movie, we can just render out all of the information. And so once again, we can be super clever with how we do this. And so what we're going to do under here is render out all of this information, the key and the associated thing. And so here what we could do is in this section here, we can create some JavaScript logic. So we could say const keys is equal to object.keysMovie. And now we just want to filter out 2 particular elements, so we can use the dot filter and we can say element. And here we can provide some truthy logic, so we can say if element is equal to name, because we already have the name, or element is equal to underscore ID, then we want to return false, and otherwise we want to return true. So this should give us all of these keys aside from that, and we should be able to see that because we can conditionally render them once again. So we can once again say keys.map key, or we can say header or like title, whatever you want. Open that up, and all the titles should be unique, so we can actually use that as the unique key. So here we can return a div, and we'll wrap this so that it prints nicely onto the new page. And here we can just render out the title and give the div, which is the top level return from the map, the key, which is also the title. So now we would expect all the titles to pop up on the page, and so here they are, which is just perfect. And now what we could actually do is give this a class name equal to styles.keyval, just like this. And we could have a syntax that's a little bit like p, and in here we can say title, and then we could actually go and render out the actual movie value, so movie for that particular title. So that should give us the value of that key. So here you can see we get exactly that. Now the other thing we might just quickly do is in here give this a padding of 8 pixels. Doesn't have to be huge. And just like that, we have a whole lot of information on all the different movies that you can have in the Lord of the Rings, which is super cool. We can see the runtimes, we can see the box office earnings, all that good information. So let's just say that's good enough for our movies display. The next one we're going to do is the books. So now we get the books, and if we come down here, we can look at what that looks like. So here we have a similar layout where it's docs, the name, and the ID. So in this particular case, we could actually just have a very similar situation. So I'm going to copy a lot of this stuff. But first we just have to make sure that we get the props and we destructure data from the props. And in here what we can do is apply a similar style. So we could actually use this exact same styling system as the movies. We can import it here, and just like we've got the movie dashboard, we can actually reuse that style in books. So we can say class name is equal to that. And here we can just render out all of our books. So that's going to be data.docs.map. We will take a book and an index, open that up, and return a div with the key equal to the index. And we can close the div. And inside of the div, we could have an h1 that has the book.name. So now we get the 3 books coming down onto the screen, which is super cool. What we could do to make it even better is actually just render out the index plus 1. And now we have the book titles or the numbers. And now we can switch between movies and books just like that, which is super easy. And then the third component is going to be characters. And so if we click on characters, we can see what information we get. And you can see that there are an infinite number of characters. And so what we're going to do here is actually also use a filtering system. So for characters, it's going to be pretty similar to the point where we can actually reuse this movie dashboard styling system, and we can copy the styles into the characters component. We'll also have to get the props out and destructure them is equal to props. However, the first thing we're going to have is an input. We'll give it a class name equal to styles.character select, just like that, and we can configure that momentarily. So here's our little input. And then after that, what we're going to do is define a state, use state, and say const character set char is equal to use state, and we'll set that to an empty string as the default parameter. And now we're going to conditionally render out data.docs as we always do. Here we can see that it's the docs where we access the thing. However, we're going to filter out characters if we have anything in the state. So it's basically going to be .filter element. We're going to open the element up onto a new line, and I'm actually going to do this up here. So I'm going to say const mapped list is equal to this filtered element just here. And we're going to say if char is equal to an empty string, we want to return true. If it's not equal to an empty string, then what we want to do is basically return whether or not it is included. So if element.includes char, then we want to also return true, and otherwise we want to return false. So basically what this logic here is going to do is it's going to check if the character is nothing. So if we haven't searched anything in the input, we're going to return all of them. If the title of the character includes the characters that we've typed, then we'll also return true, and otherwise we'll just return false. And now we can render out this map list.map and get the character and the index, and return, as we always do, a div with a key equal to the index, and we can close that div. And in here what we could do is, let's see what we get access to. So we get access to all of this information. So we're going to come into our movie dashboard, and just like we have here with the secondary keys, we're going to do the exact same thing. So that is first getting the keys. So we're going to get the keys like this. We'll do it in this JavaScript logic section up here. The top is going to be an h1 tag with the character name. So we're going to say car.name just here. And that filtering system actually works perfectly because it is exactly the same. And then what we're going to do is, for the keys, we're going to map over that exact same system as we have just before. So underneath that, we can map through and return all of these parameters. Now, this is having an issue because movie is not defined, and that's because in this particular case, it is the character, not the movie. And that is also going to be the same. So we replace both of those, make sure that that's all updated. And now we should be able to click character. And now you can see that we have all of the characters sorted out, and we can get all of the information about them. And here you can see how some of the parameters are actually empty. And so what we can do to resolve that is come up to this filtering logic just here, and we can also say if character at that particular element, and then inverse it. So get the value, which is going to be the actual string. If it doesn't exist, or it's an empty string, then this will return true, and we can consequently return false. So when I save this, I would expect it to filter out all the ones that don't exist, and we can see that that works perfectly. And so now we can just see the ones that do exist. And now what we can do is wire this logic here up to work for the searching input. So to make this input searching select, the first thing we're going to have to do is wire up the value. So the value of this input is equal to the current character. And we're also going to give it a placeholder equal to character name. Just like that. And now finally what we want to have is an onChange handler. And here we're going to take the event as an argument and set the character equal to e.target.value. And so just like this, we have character name here. And as I type, we can see that it breaks. And that's because element.includes is not a function. And this syntax almost works. And the reason it's breaking is just because we actually need to take the name parameter and check that that includes the character. So now if I have ADA, we can see that this has an ADA just there. And equally what we want to do is just set everything to lowercase. So we'll say to lowercase, just like that. And we'll also set the character to lowercase. So now we should be able to filter just like that, B, blanco, C, or D. And the last thing we just want to resolve is we have some overflowing content here. And the way that we can easily check for overflowing content is simply by coming into our dashboard and just commenting out sections of code to see what overflows. So here we have a responsive web page, whereas we notice that as soon as we include the data render, we have issues with overflowing. So if we click on books, so here we can see that the book component is still responsive. If we load all the movies, we can see that that too is nicely responsive, which is perfect. And that means that the issue must be coming from characters. And so we can come into our movie dashboard here and just say, make sure that we set max width is 100% of the parent container. And so now when we click on characters, we still get an overflow. So let's just try commenting out different sections. So what if we remove the input? So we still have the same overflowing issue. So I imagine it comes down to this div just here, which is keyval. So in keyval, we're importing our styles from here, so we can say .keyval. And we should be able to set overflow wrap to break word. And I think that we may also have to apply that same style to our h1 tag just here. So we'll say class name is equal to styles.keyval. And so to fix this overflowing issue, what we're going to set is a class name here, and that's going to be equal to styles.information. And now what we can do is come into movie modules and set .information just here, and we can say width is equal to 100% of the parent element. And the other thing we can just do to check exactly what's going on is if we say .slice, we can say 0 through 10 and get a subset of these characters, and we see that now it fits into the page. So we might just be best to set a max width equal to 100% on information. So information is here on the movie dashboard. We have already set a max width to 100%, so you just want to ensure that that's there. And then on the parent container to that, which will be our dashboard and this layout div, in layout, which is going to be in here, we want to make sure that this also has the max width of 100%. And so now when we have our characters thing, we should be able to remove this slice. And so we're still having this issue, and so I think what we're going to do is use this key value style assigned to this particular div here. And so we can target this inside of our characters, or actually our movies.module, and we can say .keyval, and we should be able to set the width to, once again, 100%, and the word break to break all. And that actually wasn't working, so instead I moved it into the information tab, and that is now successful. So now you can see that we have a perfectly responsive page, and we can type in these search features to search for particular character names and all that kind of stuff. We could swap over to the movies, it would load out all the movies and consequently the books, so on and so forth. And just like that, you have your React application. We've learned a lot of the principles that you need to go and design your own React application, so I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial. If you have, don't forget to like and sub, leave a comment down below, click the notification bell, super appreciated, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.